Yeah, okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, good. Okay, so I've written something about power generally, but also looked at um, the Frankfurt School, and I'll see how long it goes, whether I also put down some thoughts about the course generally at the end, or the thinkers we've looked at. So, what is power? According to Bertrand de Juvenal, power has an essence which is difficult to capture because it is often contradictory and consolidates itself continuously, regardless of ideologies. So, for instance, Marxism in East Germany was largely implemented by the Prussian Junker class of nobles, of the managerial class, who outwardly displayed socialist ideas but had long since taken over power from a traditional enemy of the communists, the bourgeoisie, before the Marxists even came to power. The ideas they subsequently implemented during communism were outwardly socialist but inwardly designed to increase their own power. Power, as Carl Schmitt tells us, continuously redefines its enemies. This contradictory view of power is also evident if we look at the Frankfurt School of Philosophy from the post and pre-war period. It was founded in 1923 at the Goethe University in Frankfurt am Main as the Institute for Social Research. The main enemy of the earlier guys of this school, in the view of Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno, was the culture industry, which, seen from their exile during the war in the USA, was merely a form of fascist propaganda, even when it appeared in democratic societies. The idea put forward by sociologists that the dissolution of a religious pre-capitalist society had led to a more differentiated society in terms of techniques and social structures was an illusion that could be discerned very readily in our day-to-day lives. What appeared to be a variegated culture was in fact just crude standardization, Theodor Adorno wrote in The Dialectics of the Enlightenment, a later work which he wrote with Max Horkheimer. In 1969, contrasting political programs were illusionary, he wrote, and both sides were in awe of a rigid iron-like rhythm, an accusation which he also levelled at musical forms like jazz and other contemporary music forms. Even where jazz was improvised, Adorno claimed, it was by no means an expression of individuality, but rather a faux individualization that took place within a rigid musical framework and was merely an expression of capitalist power and propaganda imposed on the masses. For Adorno, there was a continuity between pre-capitalist society and the Enlightenment, which had continued the rigid standardization of both the Church of the Middle Ages and pre-industrial society. Film, too, and radio had imposed a schema on people's ability to think for themselves as a Kantian subject, an autonomy which had worsened in the development away from the telephone to the radio. Such propaganda devices were attempts to control what people said in their day-to-day lives, and was in the spirit of logical positivism, wrote Adorno, while film was an example of the Gesamtkunstwerk of Richard Wagner, a dangerous expression of high romanticism and a spirit which Adorno saw as being key to the rise of the Nazis. Adorno himself, by contrast, was a composer of 12-tone musical compositions, having studied under Alban Berg, a highly academic and highly structured modernist technique of writing music that attempted to give equal importance to all notes on the chromatic scale, including those traditionally regarded as being out of key, a genre he considered a true expression of the spirit of anti-capitalism and the rapid standardization of the culture industry, true Enlightenment thinking as opposed to the aesthetic barbarism of jazz, as he called it. Novelty in mass culture was in fact just the exclusion of the novel, he wrote. The culture industry was a machine that rotated round and round on the spot without ever leaving its position. Every film script was checked for its sameness as a guarantee of commercial success. Kant's categories were being predetermined by schemers in all aspects of media and society in an attempt to ensure the transcendental subject and the power of the individual was repressed. The power of the media over the individual was interpreted in another way, however, by Hermann Marcuse, who had studied together with Heidegger in Freiburg and saw in the increasing sexualization of women in films during the 1950s a desire of the general public for non-normative sexual practices, the likes of which had been taboo for much of history. Machines in the workplace, he claimed in his book The One-Dimensional Man, were increasingly being made to resemble the bedroom, since it was the unconscious desire of workers to stay at home all day and indulge in erotic adventures rather than go to work, and large corporations were catering to this secret desire in an attempt to sustain their power over them. In his earlier book, Eros and Civilization, he had gone into this into greater detail. In this, he took issue with Sigmund Freud, who had claimed that the unconscious ego, which expressed the idea, e.g. for non-normative sexual practices, always had to be subordinated to the reality principle, the id, which Freud regarded as the world of work, or more specifically, the performance principle. If the id did not win over the ego, Freud believed, this would lead to the emergence of a death drive, which ultimately led to violence, barbarism, and the breakdown of society. Marcuse claimed Freud, who had praised scientific progress, was a pro-Enlightenment thinker, and in a mature, postmodern, post-capitalist society, life would no longer need to be dominated by the performance principle or the id. Ideally, societies of the future would become fully automated, thereby liberating people from the power of the performance principle, from monogamous relationships and sex solely for reproductive purposes, and from a patriarchal family, so that they could pursue eros, thereby turning this into a new aesthetic form in their heads, which he claimed by Friedrich Schiller was the basis of true aesthetics. Marcuse claimed that this was what the people truly wanted, and this could be seen from the popularity of novels and films, where the heroes and heroines were almost always adulteresses, and pursuers of unconventional love affairs. We might think of Mrs. Robinson, for instance. Thus liberated, people would cease to be dominated by labour, and their work would assume a playful element, enabling them to bring their aesthetic capabilities as human beings to full fruition, which would be the true realization of the aesthetic in Kant too. For as Kant had told us in the Critique of Practical Reason, morality was to be self-imposed by the subject's categories in an advanced, truly enlightened society. But in the society of the 1950s, Marcuse claimed, it was still defined by traditional mores. Marcuse admitted himself that his project was a utopian one, but he said that while Freud had dismissed the utopian as unachievable, contemporary society, with its advanced technologies, would be capable of making utopias a reality. The differing views of the pros and cons of power in the Frankfurt School are exemplified by the diverging attitudes of Marcuse and Adorno to the work of Sigmund Freud. Unlike Marcuse, Adorno was largely in agreement with Freud that the ego and eros had to be limited by the reality principle, the id. Though they overlapped on certain points, he was well aware of his difference with Marcuse, and once commented that the only thing stopping Marcuse from being a fascist was that he was Jewish. Of course, Adorno's scathing critique of contemporary culture, of public relations, of the advertising industry, of jazz, and the film industry also meant he was an anti-Edouard Bernays too. Like Freud, Adorno disliked what he saw of contemporary America when the Frankfurt School was exiled there, having had to flee Nazi Germany, and he saw the praise of the unconscious as stemming from German Romanticism, whether this be through PR or through Eros. It was the realization of Nietzsche's view of man being a body, which he saw as responsible for the rise of Nazism. Whereas Marcuse, who indeed cited the German Romantic poet Novalis in Eros and Civilization, attempted to frame Eros as the true logos, and he wondered in the same book whether what Christianity had meant all along by agape, caritas, was in fact eros. The project of Adorno was to expand Logos into a more comprehensive 12-tone version when compared to traditional aesthetics. To further emphasize this point, while Marcuse referred to feudal society as barbaric, Adorno referred to contemporary capitalist society as barbaric. Indeed, this separation of attitude between the two became evident too when the student revolts of the 1960s came along. Adorno claimed sympathy for some of their causes, but also referred to them as fascists in genes, while Marcuse's ideas made him one of the leading thinkers behind the sexual revolution of the 1960s. When the crisis of the 1960s was still being felt in the early 70s, it fell to a younger thinker of the Frankfurt school, who had been a student of Adorno in the 1950s, to try to solve some of the problems the decade had brought about in philosophical terms. In his 1973 book, Legitimation Crises, Jürgen Habermas describes how, whereas in feudal and early capitalist societies, crises had been caused by wars, or later by class conflict, in late capitalism, crises could be of an economic, rational, or motivational nature, or could be legitimation crises, with the latter being the key to the solution of the other three. A lack of consensus led to a legitimation crisis in democratic late capitalist societies, which was an opportunity to reformulate new Kantian forms or universals by creating new categories. This was to be a never-ending process in a social market economy of progress, crisis, reappraisal, and intersubjective consensus, in which the market, unlike in Adorno, played an important role. While he maintained the criticism of normative behaviour that the likes of Marcuse had formulated, at the same time, he saw the market and PR as something that expressed the democratic will of the people, though this was to be tempered by the social performances of the state in providing basic services such as health, care, education, etc. In doing so, however, he effectively turned his mentor Adorno's criticism of PR and the mass media completely on its head, and allied himself not just with Marcuse, but with Bernays too, by assuming a positive view of the power of the unconscious. While Adorno had often talked about the system as a barbaric force that pervades our everyday lives, he even uses the word Dasein in the German, Habermas's more positive view of the system and of the democratic principle of consensus that informed it ultimately found its expression as an ideology in the legal system. In so doing, he made the assumption, of course, that the political is downstream from the cultural. Whether this is still the case, however, after 50 years of a social market economy, whether the cultural consensus is still being taken into account is debatable. There is no guarantee, of course, that the situation Marcuse described in 1955 in Eros and Civilization, where the political governs the cultural, has not now repeated itself, and that there is always a force which eventually superimposes itself on consensus, no matter how liberal the politics are, which of course puts us in mind of somebody like Carl Schmitt or Jacques Ellul. Nicholas Luhmann took a more sophisticated view of the systemic, a view which may be more suitable for our internet age. He saw systemic power as comprising many systems which were all structurally coupled, but individually they were operationally closed. Power in the network functions as a communication medium via negative sanctions, but true power lies in the hand of a powerful actor who makes important decisions, for instance, in the case of war. William Domhoff formulated these as the economic, the political, the ideological, and the military, all of which are interlinked but are operationally separate. The idea of a powerful actor would seem to point to the idea of the political theology of Carl Schmitt, who maintained that all politics was derived from theology and states of emergency. Each political system defined certain friends and enemies, but these would change over time. Schmitt claimed that the executive branch of power, which was supposed to keep the legislative, the ideological in check, was in reality kept in check by the administrative. Liberalism and totalitarianism were in fact just two sides of the same coin, and Hannah Arendt's distinction between the two was based on her distinction between the secular and the theological. Jürgen Habermas too makes this distinction, or made this distinction, in his conversation with Joseph Ratzinger, the former pope. For instance, when he praised Kant, Habermas did, as the first true secularist. For Carl Schmitt, however, it was only logical that communism and fascism grew out of democracy. Schmitt's political theology is also reminiscent of Foucault's idea of power, for whom the subject, unlike in Kant, is twofold. On one level, it is the self, but it is also the subject in the sense of somebody who is subject to a monarch, and the concept of the individual is therefore of limited use. Governmentality is his name for all ruling systems, be they feudal or early capitalist or late capitalist. It was impossible to get away from this. Prisons, schools, hospitals, and the police were all examples of governmentality, and the subject was in the middle of a triangle between sovereignty and discipline, and had limited power. Jacques Ellul would no doubt agree with Foucault's idea of an overemphasis on individual power and proposed the idea of depoliticization. True power, he concluded, lay not in ideology, but in the administrative, a bureaucracy that consists of people merely going about their day-to-day lives, which were inevitably defined by necessity rather than ideology. The main power behind this bureaucracy lay in a technocracy, an invisible elite that might not even be aware of each other's existence. Ideological arguments and even the news were for the most part ephemeral, Ellul claimed, a simulation as in Baudrillard, or a spectacle as in Guy Debord put it, and the more people engaged in ephemeral discussions, the less effective they became politically. The politicization of every aspect of our lives, the need to justify every decision politically, such as what we eat or what we wear, was merely an example of increasing encroachment of the state machine upon people's lives. Yet if technics is indeed the singularity that unites bureaucracy, it need not become an abuse of power. It need not become a logos on its own, so to speak, but can be used in a way that benefits humanity. The printing press, for instance, was a source of liberation for European civilization. And we can see the difference between techniques as logos and techniques as technology if we consider the difference in attitude and the entourage of Philip II of France compared to Louis XVI in the 17th century. He was famous for proclaiming, "L'état c'est moi," I'm the state. It's a transition we might equally express by the contrast between eros and agape. Indeed, despite being very religious, Louis XIV was known to have produced a large number of illegitimate children himself from extramarital affairs, so he must have had a favourable view of eros himself. We cannot ultimately say, like Plato and Aristotle, which political system produces the greater good, be it democracy or more authoritarian forms of government, nor can we ultimately legislate for agape, this being more of an inward stance, a thumos, rather than a moral attitude, as Kant seemed to be claiming. In that sense, maybe both Freud and Marcuse are wrong about eros. Kierkegaard tells of preferential love, i.e. eros, is a form of love, but not love per se, and merely a lower form of agape. This stems from the lower part of Plato's tripartite nature of the soul. Possibly Louis XIV and Marcuse were merely taking the position of Thrasymachus in the Republic, while Adorno and Philip II were receiving that of Socrates. Okay.
Right. Thank you very much, Andrew. This was very impressive. You really tied everything back together. I think I spotted elements of every session, of every reading we did, really weaved it all together. Very, very impressive, very interesting to listen to, and a very fascinating deep dive, especially also into the Frankfurt School. I think it's important to engage with the Frankfurt School, especially when looking at modern society today. Interesting to see Adorno's classical approach of calling everything fascist. I don't know if you guys have ever listened to 12 tone music, but if that's the cure to fascism, then I don't. Then God help us, right? It's but but yeah. So just to add something to this, he also wrote a book called the Jargon of Authenticity, der Jargon der Eigentlichkeit, as a takedown of Heidegger, basically also finding hidden fascism in the notion of like authenticity, of there being a true self, of there being a true human being, which can be then used, for example, to mold and shape the world through authoritarian violence to match that image of the true human, for example. Just something to look at, interesting to see just from the perspective of someone who's kind of attuned all of his, let's say, all of his senses to spot out patterns of fascism. It's just interesting to see where you see these similarities, even if one must not necessarily go all the way that he did. Just one question about Marcuse and this whole reality principle over pleasure principle. It's been a while since I read Eros and Civilization, but you connected the id to the reality principle, and I was kind of confused. Would the id not be tied to the pleasure principle rather?
I think the ego is tied to the pleasure principle.
Okay, so the ego is tied to the pleasure principle and the id
I
to the
think,
reality principle. I kind of thought it was the other way around.
but I think he did change it. Yeah, in Freud, it's ego and id, and superego is the parents.
Right.
That's why I understood it. But he wanted to put the id into the ego, I
Hmm.
think. Um,
Okay. All right. Um, okay, yeah, I've tried looking it up. In Freud, the id would be operating on the pleasure principle, right? So
yeah,
just
okay.
yeah.
Hmm.
But yeah, other than that, I mean, interesting. Any jazz fans here that like to take offense or something? If there's any questions in general, just say
Perhaps
something.
it's a comment is precisely because jazz is formless. That was the merit of the art form. So it's just really a basic misunderstanding on Adorno's behalf. Sort of like being of an older generation, having this new style of music come in and not being able to recognize it for for the value it has because it's formless. And depending on the jazz musician, I know later on the musicians like Miles Davis end up making symphonic jazz in their later albums, like Bitches Brew, with
Hmm.
20-minute long tracks. So maybe that would have been more of Adorno's taste because it's cacophonic like his 12 tone music. So
Hmm. Yeah, I don't know what he would have made of Charlie Parker. I don't know
true.
whether he lived that long to. I suppose he must have done really, but he just generalized about jazz, didn't he? Without really going into great detail, from what I've read anyway.
Do
I
you
wonder
think
what. Yep, please continue.
do you think that prejudice though is an example of how strong his blind spots were? I mean, the fact that he couldn't even determine jazz as by studying it, it always struck me as he has such strong prejudices that I don't really take his opinions very seriously.
Hmm. Well, I think they're interesting to read his opinions, but yes, they're very extreme, I think. And you gave a different view of propaganda in democratic societies, I think, which was different to his. It's probably one you can work with better. But in a way, of course, with Habermas, I mean, he's more. I think he's more interesting to read than Habermas, but possibly Habermas was more practical, of course. Um, though I suppose he sort of then transformed it into something like I don't know, the Beatles or something rather than 12 tone music. So maybe I think he had a point in some ways, Adorno, but I think on jazz he was a bit, like you say, prejudiced. But I think when it comes to sort of, I don't know, some of the stuff which passes for music these days, maybe I'm just getting old myself, but it does seem just like propaganda, to be honest.
Yes.
I wonder what he would have thought of gangster rap or something like that. I don't know. In general, I find, or I do often stumble across kind of newer leftist theories or leftist theorists that advocate for a different kind of art. And the problem is, maybe I am very prejudiced here, but the problem I often have is that a lot of that stuff is just awful. It's a lot of the stuff is not something that's aesthetic to me at all. And then every time I'm thinking, how is this going to change culture? How is a large part of society going to like adopt this or even appreciate this? It seems a lot of it seems very much like actually a very kind of ivory tower inner circle that would appreciate these kind of things. It's like with a lot of modern art, right?
Yeah, maybe we could get some sort of balance between the two,
Yeah.
whereas just sort of casting bands and stuff is just really seems to be just mass produced. But yeah, something like 12-tone composition, I can't see it catching on
Exactly. Yeah.
big time. I think it's ironic, maybe in some ways, maybe that was also a sort of romanticism, even though he was saying he didn't like romanticism, he didn't like Wagner. But I think without romanticism, we would never have moved to 12-tone composition, really.
Yeah, it can be interesting to listen to like Schoenberg, Arnold Schoenberg for like some while, but it's not something you'd like. I mean, it's not something I could just get into.
I think Stravinsky also incorporated some of the 12-tone techniques into his music, which was a bit more popular, wasn't it?
Mm. Okay. If there's no more questions, thank you very much then, Andrew.